We're going to continue our notes for lesson 11 from unit 1, and I would like you to just continue this underneath your passive and active transport information that you've already started in your digital interactive notebook. The next larger subtitle that we're going to be discussing is diffusion specifically. Now, I know I brought this term up when we were discussing active versus passive transport, so this is going to further explain what diffusion is and how it actually works. So if you think about it, if you've ever taken a cup of coffee and you drop some cream in it and you just let it sit, you may notice, like in this picture, the second picture here, that the coffee will start to kind of almost be swirled with the creamer. And if you still don't continue to stir it, eventually through diffusion, the actual creamer will then be gone throughout the entire solution. Now, if you remember when we talked about active versus passive transport, we also said that molecules have a tendency to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So when we're talking about the topic of diffusion, we are really kind of focusing more on the movement of particles from an area of high concentration to low concentration. This can be in not only in an organism's body, or it can actually just occur in non-living things, like, for example, the coffee example. Another example would be a scent of perfume filling the room. If you were to spray perfume in one corner of the room, eventually, if you were standing on the opposite end, you would get to smell the perfume. That's because where you've sprayed the perfume is where you have that high concentration area of the scent, and those it'll move towards where the lower concentration is. There are also going to be, in terms of diffusion, you could have small molecules moving across a cell membrane. This is a type of diffusion, and it can either be facilitated diffusion, where it will go through that protein cell receptor, or it will just go straight through the cell membrane. And the reason why molecules behave this way is just like everything else in your body and in nature. The reason is to balance and equalize the concentration. So once again, it's going from high to low. Now, if we remember, diffusion does not require any energy, so that is why this is considered to be a passive transport. So when we're talking about it at the cellular level, we are going to refer to diffusion as a passive transport, because there'll be no energy for things to be moving from higher areas of concentration to low areas of concentration. I will tell you that this is a hyperlink to cell transport that I will include. It's a YouTube video. I will include it in this material that is posted in the Google Classroom, so that you can watch this video if you're feeling like you could use some further information. Now, when we talk about diffusion, that's really just a generic way of saying things going from high to low areas of concentration. When we're talking about specific types of movements that really still are passive, so they don't require any energy, so there's no ATP required. But when we're talking about materials that are going to move through a permeable membrane, so tiny holes, that's what's called osmosis. So osmosis is still involving a passive transport of moving molecules from a high area of concentration to a low area of concentration. But in this example, we're looking at things moving through a permeable membrane. Now, if you remember, when we see that word permeable, when we're talking about this at the cellular level, this is going to be in reference to the cell membrane, because that is going to be our permeable membrane. And what's going to determine the direction that these particles or water molecules will move is that they will once again go from an area of high concentration to the areas of low concentration. Now, in this situation over here, we have what is called a U tube, and you can see because the tube is in the shape of a U. So no, not like the channel or the website YouTube. This is actual tube that's in the U shape. What has happened here is that they have put a semi-permeable membrane to mimic what happens inside of a cell. So remember, the semi-permeable membrane in a cell, it's in reference to the cell membrane. So this is a model that is going to try and simulate what's happening at a very microscopic level, just so that you can see that. But once again, remember that things are going to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So when we look at this YouTube example here, we see the solute is going to be, we'll say that this is the salt in this solution. So whenever you see a solute, that is an actual like thing that has been dissolved into a solvent. So the solvent in this example is going to be the water. So if we were to just start off with this U tube that was just full of the solvent, which this is H2O, right? It's water, and there was that permeable, semi-permeable membrane that's in the middle of the tube. When the salt is added to the one side of the tube, what you're going to see is that then the solvent is what the water is. The water is the only thing that's going to move. And after you've let it sit for a minute, see how it says relaxation, which is kind of letting it sit for a moment. When you let it sit for a moment, where is there the higher concentration of the solute or the salt? That would be over on the right-hand side. So if we called this side B and we called this side A, the water is actually going to pass through this permeable membrane to equalize out the amount of water on this side, because this side has more solute on it. So the water is going to move in that direction. And you notice that because the water passes through, the volume is going to increase on this side, and this side it's going to drop. There has not been water reduced or taken out of this U tube. It's just a way to visually see how the water will pass through the membrane. The key thing that I want you to note here, do you notice how the solute or the salt is not going to the left or to side A? The only thing that will pass through a semi-permeable membrane in this example through osmosis is water. So the other molecules are too big. They will require an active transport, which will require ATP. So that will not be part of osmosis because that's part of diffusion, which is a passive transport. So the only thing that will pass through this semi-permeable membrane is water. Do, 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 do. So let me give you some real life examples of where osmosis occurs, because the U tube, the diagram on the right here, is just a way to visually see what happens through osmosis. And so it happens at a very, very small level. But some real life examples would be like if you're feeling thirsty after having salty food. So in your body, the material between your cells is going to have more salt in it because you've ingested that compared to what's inside of your cells. So the water is going to leave your cells, which is going to leave your vacuoles empty and make you thirsty. Another example would be you're pruning fingers and toes if you're in the water too long. So if you're in the bath and you might notice after a while, if you've been in the pool all day, you might notice that your fingers and toes have pruned up. So what actually has happened is that the solute content, so in that case, it may be salt if you're in a saltwater pool, or, if you're just in the bath, even you have some sodium in like bubble bath water and things like that. The water is going to leave your cells to go out into the surrounding environment that you're in because there is more solute out there. And another example would be too, if you have dry seeds or beans, if you maybe, for example, have ever taken like dehydrated beans or lentils or things like that and put them in water overnight, you may notice that they swell because once again, where is the lower concentration of water? Well, if they're dehydrated beans, the beans are going to have less water than the liquid that they're sitting in. So the water will actually pass through the membranes in the cells of the beans to rehydrate them. So that would be an example of osmosis. And there also is a great Amoeba Sisters video on osmosis. I'm actually going to post the Ed Puzzle video for that as an assignment for you to do after you take these notes so that you can get some more practice on identifying which way solutions will move and what's a solute and a solvent and things like that. So be looking for that after you finish these notes. Now, when we're talking about osmosis, there are certain types of solutions that our cells are exposed to and also, not only just animal cells, but also plant cells as well. And when we're talking about a solution, the key word about a solution is that it's generally some type of liquid. We're going to focus mostly on water. Okay, so it's water, H2O, plus another solute. So this could be sugar, it could be salt, And so those are going to, the two things combined together are what is going to make a solution. So there are actually three different types of solutions. So we're talking about, once again, and this is, in this example, we're really going to focus more on the solution being water and salt. So the salt is the solute, the water is the solvent. The easiest way that I can recommend this to you is that things dissolve in water. So that's how I always remember that a solvent is going to be the water or the liquid that things are dissolving in, and the solute is going to be the material that's being mixed throughout there. So this is pretty much going to be a mixture of a solution. We're going to focus, like I said, mostly on water and salt. The first type that we are going to discuss is hypotonic. So in hypotonic solutions, this is where you have a lower concentration of salt in the surrounding area than the cell. So that means that the cell actually is going to have, so due to this, what's actually going to happen is that the water is going to move into the cell. So remember, a tip that I have for you is that hypo rhymes with low. And because of the concentration gradient being of there being more water on the outside of the cell than the inside of the cell, the water is going to go from high to low. It's going to move into the cell. And so since the water is going to go into the cell, it's going to cause them to swell. And you can actually see this example of a hypotonic solution over here on this far right, where you can see that inside of the cell, there is going to be more salt, less water, and there's going to be more salt out here. So the only thing that's going, or less salt out here, the only thing that's going to move, remember, that can cross through that membrane is H2O, which is water. So that's why the water will go into the cell, because in the cell, there is less salt than outside of the cell. So the water is going to move into the cell for that example. So that's hypotonic solution. The next thing that we're going to be discussing here is a hypertonic solution. So you can notice that the first four letters are what's going to differentiate between this. So hypo means low. So think about that there's a low concentration of salt surrounding the cell, which is then meaning that there is less water inside the cell, which is why the water will flow into the cell. Now, on the opposite end of that, you have hypertonic, which is where you have a higher concentration of salt in the surrounding area than the cell. So that means that there is actually less water outside of the cell. There is more solute outside of the cell, which is the salt. So the water is going to move out of the cell. A tip that I would think of is like when you're hyper, like you're moving around a lot. So things are going to move out of the cell. This is where the cell's water will leave the cell and it will cause them to shrink. You can actually see this here too on my left hand side of my diagram. You can see the red blood cells are shriveled up. And this is once again because surrounding the cell, there is more salt, less water surrounding the cell. So the only thing that can move through the cell membrane is what, once again? H2O. So the water is going to leave the cell because there's a higher concentration of salt outside than inside the cell. So the water is going to go towards where there is a lower amount of salt, and that actually will cause the cell to shrink. The last type of solution we're going to discuss today is isotonic. So in an isotonic solution, you actually have where the salt concentration in the cells in the surrounding area is about the same. And this is what they call like the healthy, or remember, once again, everything likes to be balanced. So this is the most healthy environment for any cell to be in. The cells actually are not going to change in size because since the level of concentration in salt is the same surrounding the cell as inside of the cell, you're going to have an exchange of water molecules occurring at an even rate. So the important thing that I want you to realize, you can see right here is my isotonic. Remember, the water is still the only material that's going to flow through the cell membrane. However, the water is going to be coming out of the cell at the same rate as it's coming in. So even though that the cell's size in isotonic is not changing, it's not swelling up like hypotonic, and it's not shrinking like in hypertonic. However, there is still an exchange of water that is moving through the cell membrane. It's just not something that's as measurable because it's happening at about the same rate. This is another video too that is that does a good job of explaining the different types of solutions. If you feel like you could use some more assistance or help in understanding what these three different types of solutions are, I will also post this optional video underneath this material as well. But this does conclude our notes for 1.11. Thanks much.